The ballroom doors burst open, and she walked in holding the arm of a man she had met exactly 47 minutes ago in a gas station parking lot. And every single head in that room turned, and the music slowed, and the chandeliers above them caught the light in a way that made everything look like a dream, except it was not a dream. It was the worst and best night of her life at the exact same time, and she had no idea that the quiet man, standing beside her in a borrowed jacket, with grease still, under his fingernail on his left hand, was the same man whose face was on the cover of Forbes magazine sitting on the table by the entrance, and she had not looked at that table, and he had not said a word, and somewhere across that glittering room her enemy was already watching them and smiling the kind of smile that meant trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. Before we go any further into this night, and trust us, you're going to want to see where this goes, please take 3 seconds right now and subscribe to this channel, because we put everything we have into stories like this one, and we do not want you to miss what is coming. And if you know somebody who loves a story that grabs you by the heart and does not let go, please share this with them right now and drop a comment below and tell us what you think is about to happen, because we read every single one, and this community is everything to us now. Let's get back to that ballroom, because things are about to get very complicated very fast. Her name was not important yet. What was important was that she was 44 years old, and she had worked for 17 years at the same company, and she had given that company everything. Her weekends, her holidays, the years when her daughter was small and needed her and she was on a plane instead. She had given and given and given, and 3 weeks ago the company had given her something back. A letter. 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph said her position had been eliminated. The first paragraph thanked her for her service. There was no third paragraph. There was no phone call. There was no meeting. There was just a box of her things left by the security desk, and a key card that no longer worked, and 17 years that suddenly felt like they had happened to someone else. Her name was Claire Meadows, and tonight was not supposed to happen at all. The invitation had come 6 months ago, before the letter, before the box, before all of it. The Hartwell Foundation Gala, one of the biggest charity events on the East Coast. Black tie, invitation only. She had been invited because of her position at the company, because of who she was professionally, because she had spent 17 years building a reputation that meant something in rooms like this one. And when the letter came 3 weeks ago, her first thought, after the shock and the tears and the 1 glass of wine that turned into 3, was that she still had the invitation. They could take her job. They could take her key card. But the invitation had her name on it, and her name was still her name. She was going, not because she wanted to celebrate anything, not because she felt like being in a room full of people in expensive clothes, drinking expensive drinks, and pretending the world was wonderful. She was going because the man who had fired her was going to be there, Richard Hartwell III, the man who had looked her in the eyes 6 months ago at the last gala and told her she was the backbone of the company, the man who had smiled and shaken her hand and called her irreplaceable, the same man whose assistant had left the box of her things by the security desk without even a note inside. She was going because she needed him to see her standing tall. She needed him to see that she was fine, that she was more than fine, that whatever he had taken from her had not broken her. She needed to walk into that room and hold her head up and let him see that Claire Meadows was not a woman who disappeared quietly. The problem was that 3 days before the gala she got a phone call from her friend Dana, who was supposed to be her +1, and Dana's voice was full of apology before she even started talking, and by the time Dana finished talking, Claire understood that Dana had a family emergency, a real one, not an excuse. And of course Claire told her to go be with her family, of course. She said it was fine, and of course she meant it, and then she hung up the phone and sat on her kitchen floor for a little. Well, because she had planned on having someone beside her tonight, and now she did not. And she had survived a lot of things in her life. But walking into that room alone after losing her job felt like too much. It felt like exactly the kind of thing that Richard Hartwell III would notice. And you somehow, even if he never said a word about it, she would see in his eyes the tiny flicker of satisfaction. And she could not bear that she could not bear it. She tried to call 3 more people. One was busy. One had already made plans. One paused too long before answering, and that pause told her everything she needed to know, and she thanked that person and said goodbye and decided she would figure out herself. She did not figure out herself. Instead, she drove to the dry cleaner to pick up her gown, and then she stopped for gas because the tank was nearly empty and the gala was 40 minutes away, and she did not want to worry about gas on top of everything else, and that is when she saw him. He was standing by the air pump on the side of the building, not doing anything in particular, just standing there the way some people stand when they are somewhere between one thing and the next, and they are not in a hurry to get to either place. He was tall, not impossibly tall, but the kind of tall where you notice it. He was wearing dark pants and a dark jacket that was not fancy, but was clean, and he had a face that was hard to describe except to say it was the kind of face that had seen things and processed them quietly without making a lot of noise about it. He looked like he was maybe 48, maybe 50. It was hard to tell. There was something about him that made it hard to tell. Claire filled her tank and told herself she was not going to do what she was about to do, and then she walked over to him anyway. She said, "Excuse me," and he looked at her without surprise like he hadn't known she was coming even though that was impossible. And she said, "This is going to sound crazy." And he said, "Most things that start that way usually are." And she almost laughed because she had not laughed in 3 weeks. And he almost laughed surprised her. And she said, "I need someone to walk into a party with me tonight. And I know you do not know me, and I know this is strange, but I will pay you $300 just to stand beside me for a few hours and look like you belong there. And then we can both go home and never speak of it again." He looked at her for a long time, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that made her feel like he was actually thinking about what she had said instead of just reacting to it. Most people reacted. This man thought. And then he said, "What kind of party?" And she said, "A gala charity event, black tie." And he looked down at his jacket. And she said, "I can get you something to wear. I have a friend whose husband is about your size, and the jacket is clean and pressed." And he looked back up at her and said, $300. And she said yes, and he was quiet again for a moment, and then he said, "All right," just like that. All right. His name was Marcus. That was all he told her. Just Marcus. And she did not push for more, because she had just asked a stranger to pretend to be her date for the evening, and asking for his last name felt like it would make the whole thing more formal than it already was, which was formal enough. They drove separately to her friend's house, where she picked up the jacket, and Marcus put it on in the hallway, without complaint, and it fit like it was made for him, which was strange, because her friend's husband was not exactly the same build as this man, but somehow the jacket sat on his shoulders like it had been waiting for those particular shoulders, and Claire told herself she was not noticing his shoulders, she was noticing the jacket, and those were two completely different things. In the car on the way to the gala, she told him the basics. She told him the name of the company she used to work for. She told him it was a kind of event where people talked about money and business and connections, and that he should just nod and smile and follow her lead, and if anyone asked what he did for work, he could say he was in investments, because everyone at these things was in investments or adjacent to investments, and nobody would question it. He listened to all of this without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Is there anything else I should know?" And she thought about it and said yes. "There's a man there named Richard Hartwell III, and if you see me tense up near him, just stay close." And she said it matter-of-factly and without emotion, and he nodded and said understood, and she appreciated that he did not ask why. She did not know that Marcus had gone very still for just a fraction of a second when she said the name Richard Hartwell III. She was watching the road. She did not see it. She did not see the thing that moved behind his eyes and then closed like a door shutting quietly in a house at night. She did not know anything yet. The valet took the car, and Claire straightened her dress, and Marcus offered his arm without being asked, and she took it, and the doors opened, and the warmth and light and music of the Hartwell Foundation Gala wrapped around them like a wave, and every head turned, and the night began. What Claire felt in those first few minutes inside the ballroom was something she had not expected to feel. She had expected to feel nervous. She had expected to feel like a fraud. She had expected to feel the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people and belonging to none of them. Instead, what she felt was something closer to calm. And she realized after a moment that the calm was coming from the man beside her, from the way he stood, from the way he moved through the room like the room was no different from any other room he had ever been in. There was no tension in him, no performance, no trying. He was simply there the way a mountain is simply there, not asking to be noticed, but noticed anyway. People looked at him, not at her, at him. She had not anticipated that. A woman in a red dress stopped him near the entrance and said, "Claire, I did not know you were coming." And Claire smiled and said, "Of course I was coming." And the woman looked at Marcus with particular expression of a person who wants very much to be introduced. And Claire said, "This is Marcus." And the woman waited for more, and Marcus smiled at the woman and said, "It is a wonderful evening." And somehow that was enough. Somehow that answer satisfied the woman. And she moved on, and Claire glanced up at Marcus, and he was already looking somewhere across the room with the calm, steady gaze of a man cataloging space. And she thought for just a moment that he reminded her of someone, but the thought moved through her too fast to catch. The first hour was manageable. She moved through the room with Marcus beside her, and she smiled, and she made small talk, and she held her chin up. And she was fine. She was completely fine right up until a moment she saw Richard Hartwell III standing near the bar looking exactly the way he always looked, which was like a man who had never once in his life been told no. Richard Hartwell III was 62 years old, and handsome in a way that money makes men handsome past the age when they should stop being handsome. Silver hair, strong jaw, the kind of suit that does not have a price tag, because if you are asking about the price tag, you are not the intended customer. He was laughing at something someone had said, and his laugh was big and easy and filled the space around him, and Claire hated that laugh. She had always hated that laugh, because it was a laugh of a man who knew the room was watching and was performing for the room while pretending he was not performing for the room. He saw her. She saw him see her. There was a moment between them across the distance of the ballroom, and in that moment, everything that had happened between them professionally, the 17 years, and the letter and the box by the security desk existed in the air between them, without either of them saying a word about it. And Claire lifted her chin just slightly and held his gaze and did not look away first. Richard Hartwell III smiled. He raised his glass in a small toast in her direction, and then he started walking toward her. Claire felt Marcus shift beside her, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. He simply moved a fraction of an inch closer, and she felt it, and it steadied her in a way she could not have explained. Richard reached them, and his smile was all warmth and welcome the way a trap is all warmth and welcome before it closes. And he said, "Claire, what a wonderful surprise." And she said, "Richard, good evening." And he looked at Marcus with the open curiosity of a man who was not used to being uncertain about anyone, and said, "I do not believe we have met." And Marcus looked at Richard Hartwell III and said, "No, we have not." And something happened in that exchange, something Claire felt rather than saw, because the two men looked at each other, and the air between them was not the air between two strangers. It was something older and something heavier, and she could not understand why. Richard recovered first. He turned his smile back to Claire and said, "You look wonderful." And she said, "Thank you." And he said, "We should catch up later. There are some things I would like to say to you." And she said, "Of course." And he moved away back into the warmth and noise of the room. And Claire exhaled slowly, and Marcus said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "I am now." And she meant it more than she expected to. What she did not know was that across the room, Richard Hartwell III had stopped smiling. He was standing with his back to Claire and Marcus, and he was very still. And he was looking at nothing, and the man beside him said something, and Richard did not respond. And the man said, "Richard," and Richard turned slowly, and his face had changed, and the man looked at him with concern. And Richard said, "Quietly find out who that man is, and find out tonight." The second hour was different from the first. Something had shifted in the room. Claire could feel it without being able to name it. People who had nodded at her politely in the first hour began gravitating toward her in the second hour. Not toward her, toward Marcus. The gravitating was subtle the way these things always are in rooms like this one where directness is considered vulgar, but the movement was real, and it was toward him and through him to her, and she began to notice that the conversations were different now. Less polite, more interested. A man named Gerald, who ran one of the largest investment banks on the East Coast and who had never looked at Claire as anything more than a pleasant professional acquaintance, came over and engaged Marcus in a conversation that lasted 11 minutes. And at the end of it, Gerald shook Marcus's hand with both hands, which was not a thing Gerald did, and gave Claire a look that was entirely different from any look he had ever given her before, and moved away seeming lighter, somehow seeming like a man who had just been told something he had always hoped was true. Claire pulled Marcus slightly aside after Gerald left and said, "What did you two talk about?" And Marcus said markets, and she said markets, and he said the general state of things. And she said, "Gerald does not talk about the general state of things with people he does not know." And Marcus said, "He knew me a little." And she said, "What does that mean?" And Marcus looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "It means I met Gerald before." And she said, "Where?" And he said, "At a conference a few years ago." And She said, "What kind of conference?" And he said, "A financial one." And she looked at him carefully and said, "Marcus, what do you actually do?" And he said, "Tonight, I am your guest." And he smiled when he said it, and the smile was so disarming that she found herself smiling back before she remembered she was trying to get a straight answer. She let it go. She should not have let it go. But the room was beautiful, and she was holding her head up, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not feel like a woman who had lost something. She felt like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she did not want to interrupt that feeling with questions. That was the moment. That was the exact moment where everything that came later could have gone differently if she had pushed just a little harder. But she did not push, and the evening continued, and the evening was about to get much more complicated. There was a woman at this gala that Claire had not expected to see. Her name was Vivian Cross, and she was 40 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that requires a great deal of money to maintain, and she knew exactly what her beauty did to rooms, and she deployed it the way a general deploys an army, with calculation and timing and no mercy whatsoever. Vivian Cross was also the woman who Richard Hartwell III had been seen with at 4 separate events in the past 2 months, and the gossip columns have been writing about them in that particular way. Gossip columns write about two powerful people who are circling each other, and Vivian Cross was also, if the whispers Claire had heard before she lost her job were correct, the reason that Richard Hartwell III had been making some unusual business decisions lately, the kind of decisions that benefited Vivian's considerable investment portfolio in ways that made people raise their eyebrows when they thought nobody was watching them raise their eyebrows. Vivian saw Marcus before Marcus saw Vivian. Claire watched it happen from across the room, watched Vivian go very still in the middle of a conversation, watched her eyes lock onto Marcus like a compass finding north, watched the color leave Vivian's face just slightly, and then come back just slightly, and watch Vivian excuse herself from the conversation she was in with the smooth, practiced grace of a woman who had been excusing herself from conversations her whole life, and begin moving through the room, not toward Claire, toward Marcus. Vivian reached them, and she was smiling, and the smile was perfect, and she said, "Well, this is unexpected." And she said to Marcus, not to Claire, and Marcus looked at Vivian and said, "Hello, Vivian," and his voice was perfectly calm and perfectly neutral, the way a wall is calm and neutral. And Vivian said, "It's been a long time," and Marcus said, "It has," and Vivian looked at Claire for the first time, as if only now noticing her, and said, "And you must be a friend of Marcus's." And Claire said, "I am." And Vivian smiled again and said, "How lovely," and then she looked back at Marcus and said, "We should talk later tonight. There are things that need to be said." And Marcus said, "I am sure there are," and Vivian laughed softly, and the laugh was a kind of laugh that has nothing happy in it, and she moved away, and Claire turned to Marcus and said, "How do you know Vivian Cross?" And Marcus said, "We have some history." And Claire said, "What kind of history?" And Marcus said, "The kind that is complicated." And Claire said, "Marcus, I need you to tell me what is going on." And he looked at her, then really looked at her, and said, "I will tell you. Everything before the night is over." And she said, "That is not good enough." And he said, "It will have to be for now, and please stay close to me." And she said, "Stay close to you." And he said, "Yes, because the next few hours are going to be interesting." And she said, "Interesting how?" And he said, "The kind of interesting where it helps to not be alone." And she stared at him for a long moment, and something in her that had good instinct said, "Trust this man." And she did not know why her instinct said that about a man she had met at a gas station 2 hours ago, but they did. And against her better judgment, she listened to them. She stayed close. The dinner was served at round tables of 10, and Claire and Marcus were seated at table 7, which was not one of the important tables being 1 through 4. And she had expected that, and was fine with it, except that halfway through the first course a young man in a tuxedo came to their table and leaned down and said quietly to Marcus that there had been a change in the seating arrangement, and Mr. and Mrs. Ahicott himself, and said Marcus and guests were being moved to table 2, and Claire looked up, and the young man looked very serious, and Marcus stood without comment and offered Claire his hand, and she stood, and they followed the young man across the room, and people watched them cross the room, and she could feel the watching, and she did not understand it, and she sat down at table 2, which was a table where the most important people in the room were sitting, and across from her was a woman named Senator Patricia Wells, who represented the state of New York. And next to the senator was the CEO of one of the largest healthcare companies in America. And there were 3 other people at this table whose names Claire recognized from newspaper articles and financial reports, and none of them looked surprised to see Marcus, and all of them greeted him, and none of them greeted him the way you greet Someone you are being polite till they greeted him the way you greet someone whose opinion of you matters, and Claire sat very still and ate her salad and tried to understand what was happening and could not. Under the table, Marcus leaned slightly toward her and said, "Quietly, you are doing wonderfully." And she said under her breath, "I have no idea what is happening." And he said, "I know, and I am sorry." And she said, "You're going to explain all of this." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Tonight." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Before midnight." And he said, "Definitely before midnight." And she said, "Good." And she picked up her fork and turned to Senator Wells and said, "Senator, it is lovely to meet you." And the senator smiled and said, "The pleasure is entirely mine. I have heard a great deal about you from Marcus." And Claire went very still, because Marcus had known her for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And she said, "You have?" And the senator said, "He speaks very highly of you." And Claire said, "Does he?" And she looked at Marcus, and he was looking at the table with the smallest possible smile on his face. And she thought many things in that moment, and none of them were simple. Dinner ended, and the speeches began, and the first speech was from the head of the Hartwell Foundation, which was a woman named Barbara Chun, who was 70 years old, and had started the foundation 40 years ago with her late husband, James Hartwell, and who spoke with the kind of directness that age and grief and real accomplishment give a person, and Claire liked her immediately and completely. Barbara Chun spoke about the foundation's work in children's education and healthcare access and job training, and she spoke about it plainly without the performance that the other speeches at these events usually had, and when she sat down the applause was real, not polite. The second speech was Richard Hartwell III. He walked to the podium with the ease of a man who has given many speeches and enjoyed all of them, and he thanked everyone for coming, and he spoke about his family's legacy and about the importance of giving back and about the future of the foundation, and his voice was warm and assured, and the room responded to it the way rooms respond to a voice that knows exactly what it is doing. And Claire watched him and felt the familiar, complicated anger that she had been carrying for 3 weeks, and she breathed through it the way she had been doing for 3 weeks, which was imperfectly but adequately. And then Richard Hartwell III said something that changed the temperature of the room. He said that he had exciting news to share tonight. He said that the Hartwell Foundation was entering a new chapter. He said that after many months of negotiation, he was pleased to announce a major new partnership that would triple the foundation's endowment and expand its work across 12 additional states. He said the partner had asked to remain anonymous until the paperwork was finalized, which he expected to happen within the next 30 days. He said he was grateful beyond words for this partnership, and that it represented the most significant moment in the foundation's history since his grandmother had written the first check 40 years ago. The room applauded, and Claire applauded, because it seemed like good news for children and healthcare access and job training, and she believed in those things regardless of how she felt about Richard Hartwell III. She did not look at Marcus during the applause. She should have looked at Marcus, because if she had looked at Marcus, she would have seen that he was not applauding. He was sitting very still with his hands in his lap, and he was looking at Richard Hartwell III at the podium, and his face was not angry, and it was not happy, and it was not neutral. It was something else. It was the face of a man watching a chessboard and seeing 3 moves ahead, and not being entirely sure yet whether those moves would lead somewhere good or somewhere terrible. After the speeches there was dancing, and Claire did not expect to dance, and Marcus asked her anyway, and she said, "I do not think we should dance because this is already complicated enough." And he said it would look strange if we did not. And she said, "I do not care how it looks." And he said, "You came here tonight to look like you were fine." And she said, "That is not fair." And he said, "No, it is not, but it is true." And she looked at him for a long moment and said, "One dance." And he said, "One dance." And they walked onto the floor, and the music was slow in a way that music at these events is always slow. And he put one hand on her back and took her other hand in his, and they moved together. And it turned out that Marcus could dance, which was one more thing about him that she had not expected. And she said, "You are full of surprises tonight." And he said, "You have no idea." And she said, "I am starting to suspect that." And he said, "Can I ask you something?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Why did you really come tonight?" And she said, "I told you why." And he said, "You told me the surface reason." And she looked up at him and said, "The surface reason is the real reason." And he said, "Is it?" And she said, "I needed him to see that I was still standing." And Marcus was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "That is a good reason." And something in a way he said it made her eyes sting unexpectedly. And she looked away and said, "Do not be kind to me right now." And he said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because I have been holding it together for 3 weeks, and kindness is the one thing that makes me come apart." And he did not say anything to that. He just held her a little more steadily, and they finished the dance, and that was all. But it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. What happened next happened fast. A man Claire did not recognize came to Marcus during the second dance, which they were not having because one dance was the agreement of a man who looked like an assistant or an aide, the kind of person who carries things and whispers things and makes things happen invisibly at events like this one. And this man leaned to Marcus and said something very quietly, and Marcus's expression did not change, but his eyes did something, and he said to Claire, "Excuse me, for one moment," and she said, "Is everything." "All right," and he said, "Stay here, please, and do not go anywhere near Richard Hartwell." And she said, "Marcus, what is happening?" And he said, "I will be back in 10 minutes." And he went with the aide toward a side door, and the door closed behind them, and Claire stood on the edge of the dance floor alone. And alone felt different now from how it had felt 3 weeks ago. It felt less like an ending and more like a pause before something, and she did not know what the something was. She stood there for 3 minutes, and then Vivian Cross appeared at her elbow. Vivian said, "I think we should talk," and Claire said, "I do not think we have anything to talk about," and Vivian said, "I think we have one very specific thing to talk about, and his name is Marcus." And Claire looked at her and said, "What about him?" And Vivian said, "How well do you know him?" And Claire considered her answer carefully and said, "Well enough," and Vivian smiled a smile that had no happiness in it and said, "I doubt that very much." And Claire said, "What does that mean?" And Vivian said, "Do you know who he is?" And Claire said, "I know who he is," and she said it with more confidence than she had any right to say it with, and Vivian looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been calculation, or might have been both, and said, "Darling, he is not who you think he is." And Claire said, "And who do you think he is?" And Vivian said, "He is the most dangerous man in this room, and I do not mean that as a compliment." And then someone across the room called Vivian's name, and Vivian looked over her shoulder and then back at Claire and said, "Ask him who he really is, and ask him why he is really here, because it is not for you." And she moved away into the crowd, and Claire stood very still and felt something cold move through her. That was not the temperature of the room. Marcus came back in 8 minutes, not 10. He came back through the side door and walked directly to her, and she looked at his face and said, "Who are you?" And he said, "What did Vivian say to you?" And she said, "Answer my question." And he said, "Claire." And she said, "Do not clear me, just tell me who you are." And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Let us find somewhere quiet." And she said, "No, right here." And he said, "This is not the right place." And she said, "I do not care about the right place, I want to know right now." And he looked at her for a long time with those steady eyes, and then he said, "My full name is Marcus Elliott Webb." And she stared at him, and she waited, and he said, "I am the founder and CEO of Webb Capital Group." And she heard the words, and she understood the words individually, but together they took a moment, because Webb Capital Group was not a small company. Webb Capital Group was not a medium company. Webb Capital Group was the kind of company that got mentioned in the same breath as the largest financial institutions in the world. And she said, "That is not possible." And he said, "It is possible." And she said, "To Marcus Webb." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "You were standing at a gas station." And he said, "I was having a particular kind of day." And she said, "What kind of day?" And he said, "The kind where you do not want to be who you are for a while." And she stared at him and said, "So you are a billionaire?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "And you agreed to be my fake bodyguard for $300? And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you asked me directly and honestly and without knowing who I was, and because I could not remember the last time someone had done that." And she felt something in her chest do something complicated. And she said, "How much is $300 to you?" And he said, "It is $300. And she almost laughed again the way she had almost laughed at the gas station. And then she did not laugh because something else occurred to her, and she said, "You know Richard Hartwell?" And he paused, and she said, "You know him?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "How?" And he said, "That is a longer conversation." And she said, "Is he the anonymous partner?" "You are the anonymous partner for Foundation." And Marcus was quiet, and she said, "Marcus." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "When did this happen?" And he said, "The negotiation began 8 months ago." And she said, "8 months ago?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Before I was fired?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Did you know about me before tonight?" And he said, "No." And she looked at him, and she believed him. She did not know why she believed him, but she did. And she said, "What is going on with Richard Hartwell and Vivian Cross?" And he said, "That is the long conversation." And she said, "Start talking." They found a quiet corner near the back of the ballroom behind a column where the music was softer and the crowd was thinner, and Marcus talked, and Claire listened, and what he told her was this: Vivian Cross was not simply a woman that Richard Hartwell III was seeing. She was an investor in a fund that was quietly accumulating a position in Hartwell Industries, the parent company of the Hartwell Foundation, and she had been doing this for 14 months through a series of shell companies that were difficult to trace, but not impossible if you knew what you were looking for, and Marcus's people had found them 3 months ago. The position was not large enough yet to be a threat, but it was growing, and the pattern of accumulation suggested a specific strategy, the kind of strategy that ends with a hostile move of some kind, whether a public campaign, or a board challenge, or something else, and Vivian was smart, and Vivian was patient, and Vivian had done this before with 2 other companies, and both times it had ended badly for the original founders. Claire listened to all of this and said, "Why does this matter to you?" And Marcus said, "Because the Hartwell Foundation does real work, and Barberchin built something real, and I am not going to put $300 million into something that is about to be dismantled from the inside." And she said, $300 million. And he said yes, and she said, "That is an anonymous partnership." And he said yes, and she said, "And Richard Hartwell does not know about Vivian's position." And he said, "Richard Hartwell knows about Vivian the person. He does not know about Vivian the investor." And she said, "And you are here tonight to do what exactly?" And he said, "To make a decision." And she said, "About what?" And he said, "About whether to tell Richard before I sign anything or whether to handle it another way." And she said, "What is the other way?" And he said, "There are legal and financial mechanisms that can neutralize the position before it becomes a problem." And she said, "Without telling Richard?" And he said, "Without telling Richard." And she said, "And why would you not want to tell Richard?" And Marcus paused. And she said, "There is something else." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Tell me." And he said, "I need you to understand that I am telling you this because you asked directly and not because it reflects well on me." And she said, "Tell me." And he said, "I have known about Vivian's position for 3 months, and I did not tell Richard." And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because 3 months ago, I did not know if Richard was part of it." The silence between them after that was the kind of silence that is weight. Claire said, "You thought Richard might be working with Vivian against his own company." And Marcus said, "I did not know, and I had to be sure." And she said, "And now?" And he said, "Now I am fairly certain he is not." And she said, "Fairly certain." And he said, "Certain enough." And she said, "What changed?" And he said, "I came to this event tonight." And she said, "You came to this event to watch him?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "And you had no idea I was going to ask you to come with me?" And he said, "No, I drove myself, and I was going to walk in alone and watch on the outside, as I usually do." And she said, "And instead you came in with me." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "And did that change anything?" And he was quiet for a moment and said it changed the angle of observation. And she said, "Meaning what?" And he said, "Meaning I saw the room from a different position than I would have seen from alone." And she said, "And what did you see?" And he said, "I saw Richard's reaction when he saw you." And she said, "What kind of reaction?" And he said, "The reaction of a man who has done something he regrets." And she felt something in her chest again. And she said, "That is not your concern." And he said, "You are right, it is not." And then he said, "But it is yours." And she said, "I know." And she looked away toward the dance floor where couples were moving slowly in the warm light. And she said, "Why did you tell me all of this?" And he said, "Because you asked me to." And she said, "Most people in your position would not answer a question just because someone asked." And he said, "I am aware." And she said, "So why?" And he was quiet for a long moment and said, "Because you are the most honest person I have spoken to in longer than I can remember." And she looked at him, and she did not know what to do with that, because it was a kind of sentence that lands differently depending on what you are ready to hear, and she was not sure yet what she was ready to hear. She said, "I need some air." And he said, "Of course." And he walked with her toward the terrace doors, and she stepped out into the cool night, and the city was below them, and the lights were everywhere, and she put her hands on a railing and breathed. He stood beside her at a respectful distance, and did not say anything, and she appreciated that he did not say anything. After a while she said, "I have a daughter." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "She is 14. And he said, "Okay." And she said, "When I lost my job, the first thing I thought about after the initial shock was her." And he did not say anything. And she said, "I have been the one providing for her since she was 4 years old." And he said, "Where is her father?" And she said, "Gone." And she did not say more than that. And he did not ask more than that. And she said, "The thing that scares me most is not the money I have, savings, and I will find something else. The thing that scares me most is what she will see when she looks at me if I cannot hold my head up." And he said, "And tonight was about holding your head up?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "And have you?" And she thought about it and said, "Yes, actually I have." And he said, "Good." And she said, "Is that all you have to say?" And he said, "What else should I say?" And she said, "I do not know, something wise. Perhaps you are a billionaire, surely you have something wise to say." And he laughed, a real laugh, not a performance of a laugh. And the laugh was warm and quiet, and she liked it. And she said, "Was that funny?" And he said, "You are funny." And she said, "I am not trying to be." And he said, "I know that is why it is funny." and she almost smiled and caught herself, and he saw her catch herself, and his expression was gentle in a way that she found more dangerous than anything Vivian Cross had said all evening. She said we should go back in, and he said yes, and she said Marcus, and he said yes, and she said thank you, and he looked at her and said for what, and she said for tonight. And he said I have done nothing. And she said you have done more than you know, and she walked back inside, and he followed her, and the night was not over, and it was about to become something neither of them had planned for. Richard Hartwell III was waiting near the terrace doors. Not in an obvious way. He was talking to someone else, but he was positioned near the doors, and when Claire and Marcus came back and he excused himself from the other conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had been excusing himself from conversations for 40 years, and he stepped toward them, and he looked at Claire and said, I was hoping to find you. And she said, were you? And he said, I owe you something. And she said, that is a strong statement. And he said, it is not strong enough. And he glanced at Marcus and, so would you mind giving us a moment? And Marcus looked at Claire, and Claire said, it is all right. And Marcus nodded and moved a few steps away, but not far enough that he could not see her, and she noticed that he did not go far, and she felt something small and warm about that noticing. Richard said, I did not handle things well, and she said, no, you did not. And he said, the way it happened to box the security desk, you deserve better than that. And she said, yes, I did. And he said, I want you to know that the decision was not mine alone. And she said, Richard. And he said it was complicated. There were pressures. And she said, Richard. And he stopped, and she said, I do not need the explanation. And he said, what do you need? And she said, nothing. From you. And she said it without anger, which was somehow more powerful than anger, and his jaw tightened. And he said, that is not what I was hoping to hear. And she said, I know, and she looked at it with the clear, direct gaze of a woman who has decided she is done performing for this particular audience. And she said, I'm going to be fine, Richard. And I want you to know that not for your comfort, but because it is true, and because it matters that someone says it out loud. And he looked at her for a long moment, and something moved across his face. That might have been admiration if he had been a different kind of man. And he said, I believe you. And she said, good night, Richard. And she walked away from him and did not look back. And it was the best she felt in 3 weeks. It was maybe the best she felt in longer than 3 weeks. Marcus fell into step beside her as if he had known she was done. And she said, how did you know I was done? And he said, your posture changed. And she said, you were watching my posture. And he said, I was watching you. And she said, that is not less strange than watching my posture. And he said, no, it is not. She smiled. A real one this time. The first real smile of the evening and possibly the month. She said, I want to ask you something. And he said, ask. And she said, when this night is over, what happens? And he said, what do you want to happen? And she said, I asked you first. And he said, I would like to take you to dinner somewhere that is not a gala. And she looked at him and said, you want to take me to dinner? And he said, yes. And she said, as yourself. And he said, as myself, yes. And she said, not as a stranger at a gas station. And he said, no, as Marcus Webb, who is aware that the name comes with complications. And she said, it comes with more than complications. And he said, I know. And she said, I am not interested in complicated. And he said, I understand. And she said, my life is already complicated. And he said, I know. And she said, so why would I add more complicated to complicated? And he said, because sometimes the right complicated is worth it. And she looked at him and said, that is the wisest thing you have said all night. And he said, I have been saving it. And she laughed, this time a real laugh, not an almost laugh. And it felt like something loosening in her chest that had been tight for a long time, and maybe longer than 3 weeks, maybe longer than she wanted to admit. They were walking toward the main hall when Marcus stopped. He stopped because his phone had vibrated in his pocket, and he looked at it and his expression went still. And she said, what is it? And he said, nothing. And she said, it is not nothing. And he said, I need to make one call. And she said, Marcus. And he said, 5 minutes. And he stepped to the side, and she watched him from a few feet away as he raised the phone to his ear and spoke. And she could not hear the words, but she could hear the tone, and the tone was careful and precise the way a person's voice gets when what they're saying matters more than how they are saying it. And after about 3 minutes, he lowered the phone and stood still for a moment, and then he came back to her. She said, what happened? And he said, Vivian just moved. And she said, what does that mean? And he said, it means she filed paperwork tonight from her phone in this building to accelerate the accumulation of shares in Hartwell Industries. And she said tonight. And he said, within the last 20 minutes. And she said, why tonight? And he said, because she saw me here, and she knows I'm the anonymous partner, and she does not know that I know about her position, and she is trying to get ahead of the foundation deal before it closes, because once it closes, the foundation's endowment becomes a significant factor in the valuation, and it makes her strategy more difficult. And Claire said so she panicked, and he said she made a calculated move very fast, which is what Vivian does when she feels cornered. And Claire said, "And what do you do?" And he said, "I call my attorney." And Claire said, "And then what?" And he said, "And then I tell Richard tonight, because if I wait until morning the window gets smaller." And she said, "You're going to tell him tonight at his own gala." And he said yes. And she said, "That is going to be difficult." And he said yes. And she said, "Do you want him to come with you?" And he looked at her, and something in his face shifted. And he said, "Why would you offer that?" And she said, "Because you came with me tonight, and because you stayed close when I needed it, and because I understand what it is to walk into a hard conversation alone." And she said it, simply without making it bigger than it was. And he looked at her for what felt like a long time. And then he said yes, and she said, "Okay, then let us go find Richard Hartwell." Finding Richard Hartwell took 4 minutes. He was near the bar with 2 men Claire did not know, and Marcus touched the arm of a passing staff member and said a quiet word. And 30 seconds later, one of Richard's own aides appeared at Richard's elbow, and Richard excused himself from the 2 men and came toward them. And he looked at Claire with surprise, and then at Marcus with something more complicated than surprise. And Marcus said, "I need to speak with you privately." And Richard said, "This is not the time," and Marcus said, "It needs to be." Now Richard, and the use of the first name without the third, made Richard look at Marcus differently. And he said, "How do you know my name?" And Marcus said, "I know quite a bit more than your name. And we need to talk about Vivian Cross." And all the warmth left Richard Hartwell's face like air leaving a room. They went to a small office off the main corridor. The 3 of them. Richard closed the door and turned and said, "What is this about?" And Marcus said, "I'm going to tell you something. And I need you to hear all of it before you respond." And Richard said, "I am listening." And Marcus told him, all of it. The position, the shell companies, the 14 months, the acceleration tonight. He told it plainly and without drama, the way a person tells hard news when they respect the person they are telling it to enough not to soften it into something easier, but also not to make it harder than it has to be. Richard listened, and his face went through several things, none of which were easy to watch. And when Marcus was done, Richard was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" And Marcus said, "Because the foundation is real, and what Barberchin built is real, and I am not going to let it become a battleground for someone else's financial strategy." And Richard said, "And the partnership," and Marcus said, "The partnership stands if you want it, too." And Richard looked at him and said, "After I spent 8 months negotiating this deal, you are telling me my partner was aware of a threat to my company for 3 months and did not say anything." And Marcus said yes. And Richard said, "Why?" And Marcus said, "Because I was not certain of your involvement." And the room was very still for a moment, and Richard looked at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to categorize. And then he looked at Claire, and he said, "Did you know any of this?" And she said, "I knew what he told me tonight." And Richard said, "And you came in here with him?" And she said yes. And Richard said, "Why?" And she said, "Because someone should." And Richard looked at her for a long time and said, "I owe you more than an apology, Claire." And she said, "You owe me 17 years of my life, and that is not something you can repay at a gala." And he said, "No, it is not." And she said, "So do not try." And he nodded once, and it was the most honest exchange she had ever had with Richard Hartwell III in 17 years. Richard asked Marcus what happened next, and Marcus told him about the legal mechanisms and the timeline. And they talked for 15 minutes in the kind of focused shorthand that people with similar levels of professional intelligence fall into. And Claire sat on the small couch against the wall and listened, and she understood most of it. And the parts she did not understand she filled in from context. And at the end of it, Richard said, "I would like to proceed with a partnership." And Marcus said, "Good." And they shook hands, not a social handshake, but a real one. And then Richard looked at Claire and said, "I'm going to do something tonight that is long overdue." And she said, "What?" And he said, "I'm going to call the board chair." And she said, "Richard, it is 10:30 at night." And he said, "I know." And she said, "This can wait until morning." And he said, "No, it cannot wait until morning, because I have been letting things wait that should not have waited, and I am done with that." And he picked up his phone and walked to the corner of the room, and Claire looked at Marcus, and Marcus was already looking at her. And she said, "What are you thinking?" And he said, "I am thinking this is not how I expected tonight to go." And she said, "How did you expect it to go?" And he said, "I expected to watch from a corner and leave before the dancing." And she said, "And instead." And he said, "Instead I danced." And she said, "You are terrible at being anonymous." And he said, "I have been told that." And she said, "By who?" And he said, "Mostly by myself." And she smiled at him again, and it was becoming easier to do, and she was not sure yet whether that was a good thing or a complicated thing, and she suspected it was both. Richard finished his call and came back, and his face had something in it that had not been there before, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the way a man looks when he's made a decision he has been avoiding, and the decision turns out to be easier than the avoidance. And he looked at Claire and said, I told him to expect a proposal within the week. And she said, a proposal for what? And he said, for your reinstatement. And she went very still and said, what? And he said, your position. And she said, my position was eliminated. And he said, positions that are eliminated can be recreated. And she said, Richard. And he said, you were the backbone of this company. Those were my words, and I meant them. And I let other people make a decision I should have made myself, and I am not proud of it. And she said, I do not want charity. And he said, it is not charity, it is correction. And she said, there's a difference. And he said, yes, there is, and this is the second one. And she looked at him, and she felt complicated things the way you feel complicated things when something you have been grieving turns out to be not entirely gone, but not entirely returned either. And she said, I will think about it. And he said, that is all I am asking. And she said, okay. And he said, okay. And he opened the office door, and the sound of the gala came back into the room like light, and they walked back into it. The rest of the evening moved differently. The air had changed. Not in a way anyone else in the room would have noticed, but Claire noticed it, and Marcus noticed it, and even Richard noticed in the way he carried himself differently for the remaining hour of the event, lighter and more direct, the way people move when they have stopped carrying something they had gotten so used to carrying they had forgotten it was heavy. At 11:45, the event began to wind down, and guests were moving toward the exits, and coats were being retrieved, and small conversations were wrapping up with the particular energy of endings. And Claire found her wrap, and Marcus stood with her near the main entrance, and she said, you did not need $300 tonight. And he said, no. And she said, in fact, $300 is probably offensive to you. And he said, it is the best $300 I have ever spent. And she looked up at him and said, why? And he said, because it bought me the most honest evening I have had in years. And she said, that is a low bar, Marcus. And he said, you would be surprised. And she said, I probably would not. And he smiled. And she said, when do you want to have dinner? And he said, whenever you want. And she said, that is not an answer. And he said, Saturday. And she said, Saturday. And he said, unless that is too soon. And she said, it is not too soon, it is just dinner. And he said, just dinner. And she said, yes, just dinner. And he said, of course. And they both knew it was not just dinner, and neither of them said that out loud, because some things are better left in the space between people for a little while before they get put into words. Outside, the night was clear, and the valet brought her car, and Marcus stood with her. And she said, good night, Marcus Elliott Webb. And he said, good night, Claire Meadows. And she said, how do you know my last name? And he said, I am a very thorough person. And she said, you looked me up? And he said, I looked you up when you were in the bathroom during dinner. And she said, that is borderline. And he said, I know. And she said, what did you find? And he said, someone worth knowing. And she got into her car, and she drove away, and in the rearview mirror, she could see him standing at the top of the steps, watching her go. And she watched him until the distance made him small, and then until the turn took him out of sight. She drove home to the quiet streets, and the city moved around her, and she thought about everything that had happened in the last 4 hours, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 weeks, or maybe longer. She felt like herself. Not a diminished version of herself, and not a performing version of herself, but the actual version, the one that had been underneath all the loss and the fear and the holding it together. And she was tired the way you are tired after something real. And she was also awake the way you are awake when something has shifted, and you can feel the shift in your body before your mind is caught up with it. She parked in front of her house and sat in the car for a minute, and then she went inside and up the stairs, and she opened the door to her daughter's room, very quietly, the way she had been doing since her daughter was 4 days old, and her daughter was asleep with her hair across her face and one arm outside the blanket. And Claire stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. And she thought about what Marcus had said on the terrace about holding her head up, and she thought about what she had said to Richard about 17 years, and she thought about Saturday, and then she turned off the light in the hallway and went to her own room. And she did not cry, which was new, because she had been crying a lot at night for 3 weeks, and tonight she did not need to. She fell asleep, and in the morning everything would be different, and also exactly the same, except for the small and significant fact that the world was a little less closed than it had been the night before, and sometimes that is everything. But the morning is not where the story ends. It ends and begins again in a coffee shop 2 days later, because that is where Claire was when her phone rang, and the number was one she did not recognize, and she answered it, and a woman's voice said, is this Claire Meadows? And she said, yes. And the woman said, my name is Barbara Chun. And she said, the Barbara Chun. And the woman said, I believe Marcus Webb gave you my number. And she said, "He did not actually give me your number," and Barbara said, "No, he did. Not he gave me yours." And Claire said, "Oh," and Barbara said, "I would like to meet you for coffee if you're available." And Claire looked at the coffee in her hand and said, "I think I can manage that." And Barbara laughed a short, clean laugh and said, "Good, because I have a proposition for you, and I do not believe in wasting time at my age." And Claire said, "What kind of proposition?" And Barbara said, "The kind that requires coffee to explain." And the kind you're going to want to hear. And Claire said, when and Barbara said, "Now if you're free," and Claire looked around the coffee shop and said, "As a matter of fact," and she named the coffee shop, and Barbara said, "I know it. I will be there in 20 minutes. And she hung up, and Claire put the phone down on the table and sat with her coffee and with a particular feeling of a door opening, and this time she walked toward it. Barbara Chin arrived in 19 minutes in a dark coat and with the direct, no-nonsense energy of a woman who has built things that mattered and has no patience left for things that do not. And she sat down across from Claire and ordered tea and looked at Claire and said, "I have been trying to find someone for 8 months." And she said, "Someone for what?" And Barbara said, "Someone to run the operational expansion of the foundation." And she said, "The expansion you announced last night." And Barbara said, "Yes." And she said, "You wanted to run it." And Barbara said, "I want you to interview for it." And she said, "Barbara, we just met." And Barbara said, "Marcus told me about you 2 weeks ago." And she said, 2 weeks ago. And Barbara said, "He has been considering this partnership for a year. And he researches the people around his potential partners very thoroughly." And Claire said, "He researched me." And Barbara said, "He researched the company, and you were part of the company, and what he found was someone whose work was significantly more important to the company's success than the company's leadership was acknowledging." And she sat with that for a moment and said, "He knew about me before last night." And Barbara said, "He knew your professional record." And she said, "But not me personally." And Barbara said, "No, not you personally." And Claire thought about the gas station and the borrowed jacket and the $300 and the terrace and the dance and the office with Richard. And she said, "Why are you telling me this?" And Barbara said, "Because Marcus asked me not to." And she said, "What?" And Barbara said, "He asked me to let him tell you himself at dinner Saturday." And she said, "Then why are you telling me?" And Barbara sipped her tea and looked at Claire over the cup and said, "Because I am 70 years old, and I have very little patience for people being cautious about the things that matter." And she said, "What things?" And Barbara said, "The job and the other thing." And Claire said, "What other thing?" And Barbara looked at her steadily and said, "You know what other thing?" And Claire looked down at her coffee and said, "Yes." And Barbara said, "Good." And she said, "Marcus is a very private person." And she said, "I can tell." And Barbara said, "He has not brought anyone anywhere in 4 years." And she said, "He did not bring me. I hired him." And Barbara smiled and said, "Yes, dear, I know." And Claire said, "What does that mean?" And Barbara said, "It means that a man worth $40 billion does not stand at a gas station at 9 o'clock at night for no reason." And Claire went still and said, "What was he doing there?" And Barbara said, "He was having a particular kind of day." And she said, "What kind of day?" And Barbara said, "The kind where you drive until you do not want to be who you are, and you stop at a gas station because you need a minute, and someone walks up to you and asks for help, and it is the first honest thing anyone has asked of you in long enough that you forget to say no." And Claire felt something in her chest do the complicated thing again, and she said, "Barbara." And Barbara said, "Yes." And she said, "Is the job real?" And Barbara said, "Completely real." And she said, "And it has nothing to do with Marcus." And Barbara said, "It has everything to do with Marcus, the same way most real opportunities have everything to do with someone who saw something in you and decided to point the world in your direction. And that is not charity, that is how things work when they work right." And Claire said, "I want to think about it." And Barbara said, "Of course." And she said, "And I want the interview to be a real interview." And Barbara said, "I would not have it any other way." And she said, "And I need you to know that whatever happens with Marcus, I am my own person." And Barbara said, "My dear, if you were not your own person, Marcus would not have looked twice." And she said, "How do you know what Marcus looks for?" And Barbara said, "I have known him since he was 26 years old, and I have watched him build something extraordinary and be very alone inside it." And she said, "That is not my responsibility." And Barbara said, "No, it is not, and it is not what I am asking." And she said, "What are you asking?" And Barbara said, "I am asking you to let things be what they are without deciding what they are before they have had the chance to become it." And Claire was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "That is good advice." And Barbara said, "I have 70 years of practice." And they finished their coffee and their tea, and Barbara left in the same direct way she had arrived, and Claire sat alone at the table with the empty cups and the morning light coming through the window, and she thought about 17 years and $300 in borrowed jackets and terraces, and the way a man had held her a little more steadily when she told him not to be kind, and she thought about her daughter asleep with her arm outside the blanket, And she thought about what it means to hold your head up not for someone else to see, but because your own spine requires it. She picked up her phone, and she sent a text to the number she had been given the night before, and the text said Saturday is good, and the response came in under a minute. And it said, I know a place that is not a gala. And she said, good. And he said, 7 o'clock, and she said, 7 o'clock. And he said, Claire, and she said, yes. And he said, you held your head up all night. And she said, I had help. And he said, no, you did not. And she said, you stayed close. And he said, that is not the same as doing it for you. And she thought about that and said, no, it is not. And he said, see you Saturday. And she put the phone down. And outside the window, the city was fully awake now and moving in all directions at once. And she was part of it. And she was fine. And she was more than fine. She was standing. And that was exactly what she had come out tonight to prove. She left the coffee shop and walked out into the morning. And the morning was ordinary and complete. And 3 days later on a Saturday evening, she walked into a restaurant that was not a gala. And he was already there at a corner table. And he stood when he saw her, which was a thing men of his generation and upbringing did. And it was old-fashioned. And she did not mind old-fashioned. And he looked at her and said, you look like yourself tonight. And she sat down and said, is that a compliment? And he said, it is the best one I know. And she picked up the menu and said, what is good here? And he said, everything. And she said, that is not helpful. And he said, start with a soup. And she said, I do not usually order soup. And he said, try it tonight. And she looked at him over the menu and said, are you always as sure about things? And he said, about soup, yes. And she said, and other things. And he said, about other things, I am learning to be less certain. And she said, that sounds like growth. And he said, I've been told I was overdue for some. And she laughed, and the laugh was easy and warm and real, and outside the window the city moved, and the night was clear, and the story was not over, but the hardest part was, and that is not nothing, that is in fact everything. There is one more thing. 3 weeks later, Claire Meadows accepted the position with the Hartwell Foundation. She negotiated her own salary, which was above what Barbara had initially offered because she was her own person, and Barbara had expected nothing less. Her first project was a job training program in 3 cities that would eventually expand to 19. The program trained people who had lost jobs they had given years of their lives to. She was very good at understanding what those people needed. She knew it from the inside. And 6 months after the gala on a Thursday evening that was not special in any way, Claire was sitting at her kitchen table helping her daughter with math homework. And her daughter looked up and said, Mom. And she said, yes. And her daughter said, you seem different than before. And she said, different how? And her daughter said, like you got something back. And she looked at her daughter for a moment and said, yes. And her daughter said, what did you get back? And she said, myself. And her daughter looked at her with the calm, direct gaze of a 14-year-old who sees more than adults expect, and said, good, and went back to the math. Outside the window, the evening was doing what evenings do, becoming night slowly and without drama. And across the city in an office on the 32nd floor, a man named Marcus Elliott Webb was finishing the last meeting of a long day, and his assistant came in and said, your 7 o'clock is confirmed. And he said, good. And the assistant said, the reservation is under your name. And he said, change it. And the assistant said, to what? And he said, Meadows, and the assistant wrote it down and left, and Marcus turned a window and looked at the city below and thought about gas stations and borrowed jackets and someone asking him honestly for help in a parking lot. And the way a person can hold their head up in a hard room and make it look like the easiest thing in the world. He picked up his phone. She picked up on the second ring. She said, I was just thinking about you. And he said, I know. And she said, how could you possibly know? And he said, because it is Thursday. And she said, what does Thursday have to do with anything? And he said, I will tell you at dinner. And she said, that is not an answer. And he said, no, but it is something to look forward to. And she said, you are still terrible at being anonymous. And he said, I am working on it. And she said, how is that going? And he said, slowly, Anne. She laughed, and he said, see you tonight. And she said, see you tonight. And they hung up, and the city went on being a city, and the evening went on becoming night. And somewhere in a coffee shop and a gala and a gas station parking lot, a story had started that was not a story about money or power or billionaires or betrayal. It was a story about a woman who needed one night of standing tall and accidentally asked the right stranger for help and got something she had not known she was missing, and gave something back she had not known she had to give, and the two of them made a kind of sense together that neither of them had been looking for, and found anyway, which is how the best things usually happen, not because you planned them, but because you were honest at the right moment with the right person, and the world surprised you by being kinder than you expected. That is all. That is everything.